Okay, so for this round, kind of, I'm going to stick with innovation in trade, but kind of show you a very different modeling approach to that, one that comes from the growth in the innovation literature. And in particular, I'm going to kind of just go through one kind of particular model that I think kind of blends some of the two. If you're interested, I don't think I noted it in the notes. So this is based on a chapter in the new Handbook of International Economics that Elhanan Helpman is editing on the trade side, and it's a joint chapter with Ufuk Exogenous. Was done a lot of work in these types of models. One thing I really like about this modeling framework is that it kind of captures both kind of the Schumpeterian and the arrow forces behind innovation, whereas some of the literature has mostly focused on the Schumpeterian forces and kind of some of it mostly on the arrow one. And so kind of you'll see the tension between these two forces. Just to start, if you think about just the monopolistic competition form, kind of the endogenous innovation that we had before, that type of model only features the Schumpeterian forces. If we think about, well, what is the impact of competition on innovation? Okay, so take those monopolistic competition models, like and then kind of throw in competition, as in, okay, I'm going to throw in, say, kind of the cleanest one would be to say, hey, let me throw in import competition into that model. The impact on innovation, and you can move away from CS, you can actually go from monopolistic competition to Cournot or Bertrand competition with differentiated products. The answer is going to be unambiguously that more competition is going to reduce innovation. Okay, because in these models, what's going to happen is what is going to happen is competition is going to reduce the market size. So this is the Schumpeterian effect. It's going to reduce the market size of any single producer, right? If you don't change the mode of competition, right? So it's like monopolistic competition with either fewer or more competitors, or like Cournot with fewer or more firms, where you just add firms, then your only incentive for innovation, right, is going to be based on kind of how much output you produce. And if the competition is going to lead you in equilibrium to produce fewer units of output, that's going to lead you to innovate less. And this is kind of what's captured in the Schumpeterian forces. It's not dependent on kind of CS and exogenous markups, or even kind of you can have this in an oligopoly model. You just don't get kind of this arrow effect that's telling you that it's not the leader. It's like this follower has this extra incentive to basically catch up with the leader, and that's going to give you an extra boost to innovation. So that's missing from those models, and I'll show you kind of how you can put that force kind of back in, while keeping still the Schumpeterian forces. So a lot of the ones that focused on arrow, and including kind of his original work, right, only featured that one force. So all of the innovation was done by the follower, who was kind of catching up with the leader. The leader had no incentive for innovation. So I'll show you a model where the leader has an incentive for innovation. They're going to be kind of this Schumpeterian force of, you throw in some exogenous entrants, and that's going to lower the innovation response. But at the same time, there's this extra kick to innovation by firms that are going to be very close together, this escape competition. A little bit of a preview, just to say, like, you clearly, we want to think about models that have both like this kind of arrow effect and the Schumpeterian effect, because there's a lot of evidence that shows that kind of tougher competition can lead to higher innovation. Now, a lot of that literature hasn't done that kind of comparative static exactly the way I described it as, competition as throwing just some additional firms into the mix. Although some of us have, so some of the work that Philippe has done has specifically looked at kind of foreign firm entry, right? So if you really focus on foreign firm entry, if you don't have this endogenous type of competition that I will introduce, this escape competition, it's always kind of monopolistic competition, or it's a monopoly, or it's a corner oligopoly. You can't generate a positive effect of this on innovation. What you really need is something where in equilibrium, as I was just saying before, the firm to innovate more is going to be able to kind of produce more if we keep the type of competition stable between the firms. I'll talk more about kind of the inverted U one to kind of show you the mechanics of the model, kind of with kind of these wrinkles that were in their paper. Just to mention that some of the earlier literature looking at, well, what is the relationship between kind of competition and innovation, was measuring competition in a way that once you have kind of heterogeneous firms, is far from ideal by kind of looking at things like concentration measures, right? So it's not clear that we want to think about take a concentration measure. So for example, take the Herfindahl. It's really not clear whether we want to think about like a high concentration, something that's necessarily means that there's very low competition, for example, right? It could also mean something about the shape of the distribution, where there are relatively few, much more productive firms that have high market share. Gary.
So there's potentially another, I think it's another avenue by which competition can produce more innovation. And that's simply the idea that with more firms out there, there are more independent ideas, and perhaps there's a higher probability that one of these ideas will work out. Has anything like that been embodied in the trade literature?
Yeah, so definitely. So like this idea of spillovers, there's a lot in that area. So I talked about very briefly about Tom's paper, where there was this kind of direct learning between incumbents and entrants. There are other spillovers which kind of precisely kind of look at that, where you're kind of matching with existing producers. So for example, one possible link between trade and innovation can be, the more people I potentially can match up with, the more chance I have of kind of learning something specific that's going to give me a technology boost. And so there are papers that have looked at this. Those are kind of exogenous. So here I should have mentioned that I'm focusing on kind of these endogenous innovation decisions by the firm. There's this separate literature that's looked at the dynamics of that's called kind of exogenous innovation, or kind of technological change, and how it's different in a closed and an open economy setting. And so there's some papers, actually a lot of papers in lots of different ways that do exactly what you suggest. And so kind of one benefit of trade is just that, you potentially match with more and then so kind of one question for the literature is it you just learn equally from kind of having a domestic firm relative to a foreign firm? Is it about kind of seeing new products that you kind of reverse engineer? And so there's been work that's kind of used kind of different ones of these mechanics to basically kind of generate growth, but generate growth in a way where the firm is not kind of making this endogenous decision about what technology it's going to have. Yeah, first go ahead.
Going back to the slides from earlier, so trade helps exporters grow inside. Is there competition about
Well, because in the so everything was in the CES world, so it was always kind of, so in all the, and for example, the model that I showed you in those kind of computational simulations, right? This is a monopolistic competition equilibrium, so all the firms are competing. There's kind of exporters and non-exporters. I didn't show it to you, but essentially there's the key equilibrium variable is there's a CS price index, right? And there's a time path of that price index that solves the shooting algorithm for the time path of the tariff that I showed you, right? And so that's all part of that same equilibrium. Actually, I don't have the slide ever. For example, in the slide where I showed you kind of the innovation responses throughout the spectrum of productivity, right? There were some exporters to the right of the cutoff, some non-exporters, and they were all kind of making innovation decisions. And there is this kind of competition that when you have more firms, more product variety, that kind of shows up in the price index. It reduces, it pushes in the residual demand curve for kind of all firms, right? What we'll see that's very different in kind of introducing this kind of arrow effect is that it's not just this shift in of your demand curve for every firm. It's like this complete kind of potential replacement, right? That you go from like not earning any profits to kind of getting the whole market to yourself. That's going to be very different. Yeah. I'm sure I missed the.
So what exactly? I mean, I understood what Eric said, but I kind of missed what's the intuition that you were giving for. I understood the Schumpeter.
Yeah.
You didn't quite understand the counter out.
The arrow
that you tried to explain about why. Yeah, the arrow thing. Like
so I'll show you that kind of the arrow effect, but kind of like the most basic one is think of it as the following, that no matter how far, actually I think, let me see if I have that. Well, it's kind of getting into the model, but think about it. So there's a vertical kind of quality differentiation, right? Where you innovate and you increase your quality, okay? But think of a world now where it doesn't matter how far ahead the leader is in terms of their innovation. If the follower can innovate, they basically jump to the technology of the leader, maybe even leapfrogs them, right? So from that point of view, the innovation incentives are always skewed towards the follower relative to the leader, right? Because from the leader's perspective, you know, whether you're 1 step ahead or 2 steps ahead or 3 steps ahead, it doesn't matter. You just have the whole market to yourself, right? And from the follower's point of view, it's like you're not earning any profits, right? And if you're successful, you go from 0 to now you're becoming the new leader. So that's really kind of stacking kind of all the innovation incentives to the follower.
Why does that mean that more competition would encourage more innovation?
Well, in the sense that you add, I'll be more explicit in this version here. You're right. It's not clear in kind of that basic intuition that I give. I'll be very clear about what comes. So what I like about this model is I'll show you a type of competition that has the Schumpeterian effect, and I'll show you a type of competition that has this arrow effect. And that's what I like about this model, is that it kind of has both.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perhaps one way of putting it is, if there are just a few firms, they're all earning a nice chunk of profits. And so perhaps they don't have much incentive to innovate because the additional profit they would get is comparatively small. There are lots of firms who are earning very low profit, then the benefit of becoming a monopolist is higher.
But the key thing, Eric, there is you have to introduce something where you become the monopolist, right? Because if you have the Cournot version of your model and you just add another firm, you only get that Schumpeterian effect.
That's
right? So that's this key to kind of getting this other effect, is somehow you have to explain that kind of you move away from from the pack,
Yeah.
right?
No, but Eric explained to me how the two things are related.
Yeah. So, but still, I would still kind of push back that says like, because, right, so Eric said, well, I add more firms, and I'm like, well, but if you keep the type of competition the same, you don't, right? So
It's important
that,
when you
yeah.
have that, you.
So the key thing is about you're leaving the you're escaping the pack. Yeah. Okay, so here's just a way of formalizing this. It's a way that makes kind of the model, even kind of with growth, tractable. So think about the following setting. So it's a kind of all the producers here, they're producing intermediate goods, and the intermediate goods produce a final good. And then the final good is then used for consumption. It's used for paying for the innovation costs that I'll show you in a second, that are going to be exactly the same form that I showed you before. And it also is the key input to the intermediate good producers. And then the labor here is just used in the competitive final good sector to produce output. This is a functional form that's actually really kind of convenient, because like the one key parameter is this beta, which is playing tons of different roles. So not very key if you want to do some comparative statics related to beta. Actually, just don't do comparative statics related to beta in this type of model, right? It's like beta is the share of the fixed factor here, which is labor, right? The intermediate goods kind of can keep growing. It also serves as the inverse elasticity of substitution between the intermediate varieties. And on top of this, it's kind of normalizing the units of quality. So what you see here is K is the amount of the intermediate good, and Q is the quality of the intermediate goods. Okay, so it's playing all these roles. We kind of had some versions where we had separate parameters for each. It kind of makes it way more messy, and kind of the basic intuition that I want to give you kind of is the same in both, with kind of the cost of this beta parameter kind of mixing a whole bunch of things. But then kind of one nice thing is you can just put this in a very simple model of growth, where you can kind of see how the growth happens, right? The intermediate good producers are going to invest in higher Q, that increases the quality of the intermediate good. It's going to allow you to produce more output. More output is going to lead to higher consumption. It's going to also allow the intermediate producers to kind of produce more and higher quality versions of those goods. And in this version, I'm going to stay. So this is kind of part of that this framework. Kind of think about a fixed number of these intermediate goods. So after talking about how important kind of product variety is, showing you a model here where, from the intermediate good side, product variety is going to be exogenous. Okay, so from here on out, I'm going to kind of drop the time subscripts. I'm going to normalize the price of the final good to 1. So that's kind of my numeraire good. Remember that the output good is going to be competitive. So that kind of tells me what these prices are going to be, these factor prices are going to be. The price, the price for labor is going to be paid its marginal product. And since the intermediate goods are used in production here, the price of the intermediate goods are also going to be set at their marginal product for the final good. Each variety J is going to be produced by a monopolist. So this is kind of, you'll see kind of how the competition changes, and kind of it has a constant marginal cost essentially of eta. So every unit it produces, it costs eta to produce. So it has this very kind of simple profit function. The more of it sells, and its cost is just going to be linear in how many units it's producing. So the equilibrium on the intermediate good side is going to lead to just a scale equation that's going to link how much of the intermediate good is produced as a function of the quality of that that intermediate good. And then there's going to be the standard monopoly markup pricing that's going to be related to, so eta is a marginal cost. And remember, beta is playing kind of this multiple role here. Beta is playing the role as the elasticity of substitution, which is determining the markup. So then what this is going to lead to is it's going to lead to profit of the monopolist being essentially proportional to the quality of that intermediate good. And so this kind of proportionality is going to end up being very useful. Of course, market size here is also going to play a key role here. Okay, so innovation is going to be it's really kind of the same as what I showed you before. So successful innovation is going to increase that quality, right? And it's going to increase it by a step lambda, just kind of like I showed you before. So before, that was that iota that I had showed you before that we had in the previous one. Same way of modeling this kind of continuous innovation effort. So before I had called this alpha, using the notation now from that different literature. So now we're calling this X. So XJ is the innovation effort, which is going to be that probability of a successful innovation. Okay. And to make the model as simple as possible, I'm going to actually specify that convex function for innovation, and kind of everything goes through with more kind of complicated versions. This is going to be the convex cost. The cost of innovation is just going to be this simple quadratic where I'm giving myself one extra parameter theta that is telling me when theta is higher, innovation is going to be more costly. Okay, I'm doing the same trick that I showed you before, which is I'm scaling up the innovation cost by the quality for every producer. And again, this is something that's going to generate this kind of stable equilibrium distribution for the firms, right? If I didn't have this QJ in there, if they had the same cost, everybody had the same cost regardless of the Q, the higher Q firms would keep innovating more and more and more, and there wouldn't be this stationary distribution. So this kind of same form of scaling up. Okay. The kind of Schumpeterian competition here is going to be this exogenous probability of entry ZJ. And for simplicity now, I'll kind of talk a little bit more about that later, kind of how to think about it. Just think of it that when entry occurs, it just displaces the incumbent and drives the profits to zero. Okay. So now I'm going to kind of describe, I'll show you the version that has with how it can go into a fully dynamic model. You can get kind of most of the intuition by just thinking about this myopic version where the producers, in terms of their innovation decision, they're just thinking one step ahead. There's kind of one key kind of difference, and I'll highlight that when I talk about, I'll highlight that when I get to this. So the expected profit of a myopic firm is a firm that's just thinking about its expected profit next period. And by the way, this looks very similar to the one that I showed you before when I introduced that kind of static innovation choice, right? So first, with probability ZJ, there's entry and my profits are wiped out to zero. So I have a zero here. So everything else is weighted by 1 minus ZJ. Entry doesn't occur, okay? And then with probability XJ, right, my innovation is successful. And so my profits get bumped up by step lambda, right? And then if they're not, I'm just stuck with my lower level of profit. And of course, I have to pay for my innovation, which is what we see here using the quadratic form, okay? Again, the reason for kind of using this is you get this very, very simple first order condition, right? That says that my innovation effort is just going to look like this, right? And already here, you can see a lot of determinants of kind of innovation effort. So when I'm in a bigger market, I am going to innovate more, right? So we already kind of talked about it, that effect. So here, this kind of prediction really matters about whether you allow for endogenous product variety or not. So here, when we have a bigger market, there's a fixed number of intermediate good producers, so they each have a bigger market, which could potentially be taken away from by entrants. It's possible here, but I've just separated that effect, right? So here, clearly more entry is going to reduce this, right? And there's some versions with monopolistic competition and free entry where essentially the impact of these two exactly offset each other, right? If you have more firms, but you have more entry, they can, in equilibrium, the firm size doesn't change and it doesn't change their innovation effort. So here you kind of see the two separate channels. You know, higher innovation step lambda is going to increase innovation. Okay, so now let me talk about the endogenous competition part. Okay, so when you have multiple, so now think about having multiple incumbents producing for the same variety. So this is where kind of the type of competition is radically going to change from, you know, you're a monopolist to you compete Bertrand producing the exact same intermediate good, which is going to drive your profits to zero. Okay, so this is kind of the new function that kind of explains that basically says, you know, you just, in terms of kind of quantity, all of the intermediate goods produced by the competition are perfect substitutes for one another. You have Bertrand competition, profits get driven to zero. So only the producer with the highest quality is going to produce. And I'm going to assume that there's no limit pricing because the monopolist kind of markup is going to be unconstrained by limit pricing. So a high enough step size that I don't need to worry about that. So one thing that's unfortunate with the myopic case, and the one thing that's different when we go to the fully dynamic one, is in this case, you see there's no incentive for a follower to innovate, right? So there's going to be the incentive for the leader to innovate. That's going to be exactly the same as just the single monopolist case. Here, notice that if you're myopic and you're one step behind, if you're only looking one step further, right? If the best that you can do is kind of catch up to the leader, your profits are still going to be wiped out because you're going to be in Bertrand competition between them. If you're myopic, then you have no incentive to innovate, right? That's one thing that kind of, when you put it in a fully dynamic model, that's going to disappear, because then you have the incentive to kind of catch up and then potentially move ahead, right? So that's going to give back the incentives to innovate to the follower. But what I really am going to want to focus here is not so much on the follower, is to think about kind of having a single leader versus neck and neck leaders, where they're going to be two firms at the same level of quality. Okay, so if you have a single, so two possible equilibria here. You can have a single leader, in which case we're basically back to the innovation case that I showed you before with a monopolist, right? So nothing has changed. There's no risk of that leader being taken over by the follower in this case, because the follower isn't going to innovate. But then the other kind of key one is what happens when you have neck and neck leaders. Okay, so you have two firms or more than two firms that are at the highest level. They're currently earning zero profits, right? But this is the thing that kind of Eric said. Now, right, this is how I'm formalizing this. You innovate, you move ahead, and you get all of those profits, right? So this is this kind of escape competition effect. And notice how, again, it's very different than those kind of Schumpeterian forces, right? So it's not where it's like, you know, you always have Cournot competition and you kind of advance one level, or you have one more firm that you're competing against. Here, this, you know, you're going from Bertrand competition, your profits are zero, to you're the single monopolist if you move ahead, right? And we're going to see how this generates this extra kick to competition. Okay, so here's the kind of neck and neck firms. So consider kind of firm F. I'm going to call one of these firms. I'm going to call, because there's several of them, but I'm calling one of those firms firm 0. Before kind of 1 was the leader firm. So it has this quality here along with potentially many other firms. So this is kind of an extension that we work through a lot of the literature. You either have one firm or you have 2 firms, and here you can kind of have multiple neck and neck firms. So the firm is only going to earn, if you're neck and neck, then you're only going to earn positive profits, right? If your innovation is successful, right? Like you move ahead, and none of your rivals' innovation is successful, because then you again end up with multiple firms being neck and neck at the last one, and you don't get wiped out by entry, right? So this is kind of what the profit function is going to look like. You know, you don't get wiped out by entry, so with probability 1 minus zj, right? And none of the innovations of your competitors that are neck and neck is going to be successful, okay? And that so this is going to be the probability. So what is your expected profit? Your expected profit now is going to be this, right? So long as you don't get wiped out by entry, and all your innovation and all your competitors are not successful, you're going to earn that level of profit of your initial quality, and you're going to get that bump up in that innovation step lambda, okay? And then of course you're going to pay for your innovation cost, all right? And so the first order condition here is that determines your innovation effort is going to look like this, okay? And just contrast this to the one where it's just a single leader, which is kind of the single monopolist that looks like this, okay? Yeah.
I don't understand the point about followers not having an incentive to innovate. What if the step size is large enough that I'm just behind the leader and I innovate, and I become the leader, and my costs are small enough that
Oh, but you can't. So right. So I don't think I kind of clarified this. So I'm thinking about so think about this. Think about the steps for Q look like this. So these are the steps for Q. Okay. So there are these fixed intervals, and they always go up by lambda. Okay. So the follower, so one possibility is, you know, so here's Q minus 1, and Q1 is my leader here, right? So I mean, you know, it's rigged kind of so that it happens, you know, it happens that way, right? And then the neck and neck one that I'm describing is this, where there's my 0 firm and then my other QF firms that are right here, and they're kind of competing to kind of get to this level here. So here's a first order condition for the innovation choice by my neck and neck firm. And I wrote this in this form just because it makes it easier to do these. You can visually do kind of the comparative static. So kind of notice that there are parts of it that kind of look the same, like this exogenous entry component that's going to wipe out my profit kind of impacts both the firms in the same way, whether you're the leader or you're the neck and neck follower. Kind of the market size effect and the innovation cost have the same exact functional form. Right? The key difference here is the lambda versus the 1 plus lambda. And this is kind of this escape competition, right? So the leader still has its incentive to innovate in this type of model, right? Because you still get that extra benefit from having your quality go up by lambda, right? Which is right here. The follower has this extra incentive, right? Because it's not that I earn profits and my profits go up by lambda. It's I'm going from 0 profits to positive profits. So I have the lambda component, but I have the 1 plus the lambda component. And this discretely is a force that discretely raises, right, the innovation effort for the neck and neck leader. So this is kind of the formalization of this escape competition that Eric was talking about, at the same time as having kind of the Schumpeterian effect, right, that comes through Z that's going to be negative, right? Now, the last part that I didn't talk about is to say, well, I also have what my other competitors are doing, and this is clearly another kind of Schumpeterian negative effect, right? That the more, so clearly in this relationship, the higher is NJ, the lower is going to be my innovation effort, because I'm also worrying about getting replaced, not just by entrant, but getting replaced by one of my other neck and neck firms, also innovating and ending up with zero profits. Okay. But what you can show is for kind of any NJ, I can find a parameter configuration that is going to lead to higher innovation by the neck and neck firm than by the leader. And this is kind of highlighting what I'm calling this kind of arrow replacement or escape competition effect. In fact, you can kind of see that by playing around with a lambda. If lambda is low enough, right, that's the only thing that's giving the incentive for the leader to innovate. Even with very low lambda, the follower still has this incentive to innovate, which is to escape from earning zero profits. Okay. So this we all have in the myopic case. You can kind of put it in the fully dynamic version. It gets, then you move to computational stuff. So you can't really write it down analytically, derive it with pencil and paper, but these same forces are there. Exactly the same condition about potentially the neck and neck leader innovating more. And the one big bonus that you get from going to the fully dynamic one is then the follower also has an incentive to innovate, right? But the highest innovation effort is depending on lambda, going to be potentially for this kind of neck and neck firm. So you can do the fully dynamic. You can do the fully dynamic version. If you do the fully dynamic version, then one thing that you do within the model. So right now, I was thinking of entry and innovation as a probability, right? So then you kind of have to convert those to kind of flow rates in a continuous time model. So now they have this interpretation. Profit, the flow profit still has exactly the same functional form. You put that in the background, they're consumers that are saving, that kind of delivers an endogenous interest rate and kind of the typical kind of macro models. And one thing that's nice about exactly this functional form that I showed you is without the escape competition part, just a monopolist version that I showed you earlier, you can actually solve in closed form. So what you can kind of check is if you guess that the value function has this very simple form that is just going to be proportional to your quality, you can find that that is indeed the right functional form, that solves the Bellman equation with the proportional impact being here. And you can derive in closed form solution the innovation by the monopolist, which again is going to have exactly the same comparative statics as in the myopic case, except it looks a little bit nastier, but kind of same direction for all the comparative statics. Yeah.
Given that now the model is in continuous time, we still have a mass of firms competing at the same step of the quality level.
Oh, so now I've been limited. So I haven't done escape competition with this. Okay. Right. So this is just now my model is I have a single firm that's moving and there's going to be growth in this model. I have a single firm that is moving up and up and up these quality ladders. That's what's happening. You can now add escape competition. Okay. Ufuk has worked on versions of this that have this. There is no longer a closed form solution for the value function. Okay, but you can add it back in the dynamic version. Yeah, this is what actually this is one where he does it in, he has two versions, but this is one where he does it in the open economy setting. So again, this is one where he does it in an open economy setting, but where there can only ever be two firms in competing for a particular good, and the international component comes from like one firm is domestic, one firm is foreign. Okay, then again, the other benefit that you get that you don't get from the static version is that the followers now have an incentive to innovate, right? Which that's the one thing that just gets killed in the myopic version. What's nice is the myopic version doesn't kill this intuition and this property about the escape competition, that competition can potentially be highest for neck and neck. And this is kind of this impact of competition relative to not having that competition and being an incumbent leader. So for, in terms of normative implications relative to essentially I didn't really mention it, but the trade liberalization dynamics that I was showing you is essentially the transition dynamics of a steady state model that is an Atkinson and Burstein JPE paper. In this case, the normative implications relative to the model I was showing you before are going to be very different. Actually, let me get to that later. Here, because there's going to be they're going to kind of two things. First one is there's this kind of spillover from incumbents to entrants. That's kind of the nature of the spillover, similar to the paper by Tom Sampson that I was describing before. Notice here that in this kind of model, the entrant, kind of when there's entry, the entrant is always going to enter and kind of wipe out the incumbent, right? So that's kind of you're conferring some kind of technology advantage to the entrant that's based on how far up the incumbent is, right? So there's that kind of spillover in this model. There's also the fact that there's underinvestment in our R&D because the firms don't internalize the business stealing effect of their innovation. So kind of when you do the normative implications, you almost always get kind of what the planner wants to do is to subsidize innovation because of those two forces, like those kind of spillovers, and the business stealing effect is not being internalized by the firms in the marketplace. Yeah.
If the market size increases by innovation, in the net competition, the optimal number of firms is 2, because if there are 3 firms, the incentive go down to.
So in the version I showed you, what I liked about the myopic version is you can have any number of neck and neck firms.
No, but yes, but the maximum for maximum innovation.
Yeah. Oh, maximum innovation is 2.
Firms.
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
But
yes.
If the market increases by innovation, the L increases. If you have like multiple innovations and the market size increases, then maybe more.
Yeah. So this version, this hasn't been worked out. So the dynamic version has only been worked out with 2, but this kind of myopic version with N, you can also put into a dynamic model, right? And then you're going to get, you're going to get kind of an evolution of how many firms, right? Like, so think of this model, typically the way these models are solved, I haven't kind of closed that modeling part, is you have a continuum, or you have a certain number, but typically a continuum of these sectors J, right? And then this model is going to predict a distribution of how many sectors are going to have just a single leader and how many sectors are going to be neck and neck. And when you're neck and neck, there's going to be a distribution of how many firms are going to be neck and neck firms, right? And yes, depending on how many neck and neck firms you're going to have, it's going to affect the global rate of innovation in this economy. And the maximum one here, so in these cases here where this is the highest, the maximum one that you get is going to be when you have two neck and neck firms. So this is a version without escape competition. You can add escape competition. I talked about that. So there are the normative implications. Oh, let me just kind of add this part. So another thing that I like about the model that I showed you, even kind of forget about escape competition, just go back to just the single monopolist. You can also do it with escape competition, but go back to just the single monopolist, right? You can do an open economy version of this. If you're interested, it's in the handbook chapter. What I like about that one is then now you can kind of look at the incentive, the innovation by, so first you get selection, you get that, you get a quality threshold that the producers above a certain Q are going to export. You get the feature that the innovation by the higher Q firms that export is higher than the innovation by the low Q firms that don't export. But you also get that the highest innovation is going to be by the new exporters, the ones for which kind of the rise in their Q is going to allow them to export, and that's going to be the highest level of innovation. Yeah.
I'm not seeing something on the normative point about business deal. But suppose that you and I are competitors, and I put in a little bit more innovation. That imposes a negative externality on you because now there's a chance that I'll take over the business. So that doesn't that suggest that there'll be too much innovation? I'm better off, you're worse off. I don't take into account the fact that you're worse off.
I don't. Oh, this one, yes, is under, yes, is under, yes, yes. Yeah, wait, there is also, due to the problem.
But this is without escape. The entry.
No, this is not the escape. Yes, this is not the escape the escape competition is different. Yes. Yeah, this is the exogenous entry. The escape competition is much more complicated. Yes. So potentially it can go that way. One thing that's hard about the normative versions of this is it ends up being very tied to kind of these quantitative forms. In the papers that I've seen that I've done that, the other effects really tend to dominate, and so you get, the planner just wants to innovate more relative to the market.
Sorry, is this possible for the so I'm thinking the incumbents, whether there is a case that the incumbents are happy for the new entries, because we are only considering the spillovers from the incumbents. But it may be the case that the new entrants has a effect on the incumbents' innovation. So the large firms has the incentive to invest in the new entries with smaller firms so that they actually benefit from that. Is that possible to have like the inverse effect here?
Not in this model. No, there's nothing good for the incumbent about having kind of more of having more competition.
But
was that the question?
Yeah, I'm just thinking whether it's possible to add this effect.
That kind of so I think if I understand that, I think it goes back to a question that Eric had, that you do have growth models where when you have more, you can learn from other producers, right? So then having these other producers is kind of a good thing for growth. I haven't seen this combined with an endogenous innovation decision component. So it's just basically a spillover effect that is, for example, affected by trade. But I guess potentially you could kind of put both in, where you have both a private incentive to innovate, and then you also have this kind of spillover effect that says, oh, but I could also just randomly match with another firm and learn from them. But I haven't seen a model that's worked out both together.
Okay, thank you.
There's no spillover from the campus.
Yes, because the entrants are always entering. It doesn't matter where, right? It's in like the Atkinson and Bernstein world, there's no spillover because the entrants always enter with a given productivity level, right? No matter where the rest of the firms are. Here you're always, So it's generating, it's assuming it, yeah. Because I mean, or if, to put it another way, if you could, if you randomize over that, then any entrant that entered kind of below would have no effect, right? So the only thing that you would care about would be the entrants that are above. But the thing that generates growth in this model, right, is the fact that you're always moving up the entrance, right? Because in the dynamic version, this is increasing over time, right?
Yeah, but you don't need the entrance to get the growth, right? Suppose you took out from your model the entrance.
Yeah, so then you would still get a form, yeah.
You would still get.
Without the spillover, you would still get the growth just from the monopolist fund. Yes,
The competition.
yes. Just to get ahead. Yes, yeah. So you would just so that one just kind of relies on this kind of loop that it's like you're using the intermediate goods for production. You innovate, so it's kind of it's kind of a version of kind of a Solo Ramsey model where you have growth. Yeah. Yes. But the welfare implications then are different when you have the entry effect. Oh, and I did notice, I didn't mention, I think I had it on, I also had a one slide for the escape competition. Where did I have it? About where the entrants come in. Well, let me just mention it. So now if you want to think about the dynamic version of this model, you have to be careful about where the entrants come in, because you get a feature that the equilibrium where you just have a single incumbent is going to be the absorbing state, right? So kind of if the entrant, so without the entrant, even if I have n firms, right? At some point, I'm going to end up with just a single firm being the leader, right? And in the myopic version, that's just going to be the absorbing state, right? Nothing's going to change, right? So one thing that you get kind of with the entry component is you can kind of just break that by basically saying, when the entry occurs, the entrant always enters just one step ahead instead of multiple steps ahead potentially and wiping it out. It always enters just one step ahead of the highest technology, right? Which also is a way of kind of motivating kind of putting a specific form on that spillover. And then what you get is you break the feature of the leader being the absorbing state, right? Because then what you have is whenever you have entry, the entry occurs. Now, with some given probability, none of the neck and neck firms in innovation is successful when you just have the leader. But with another probability, these neck and neck firms are innovating, some of them are going to be successful, and you end up with a certain number of firms again in the leading position. This generates actually a well-defined distribution of how many neck and neck firms can you expect across your continuums of sector J. Yeah. No, because the followers, yes, yeah, the followers can, yes, yeah. So you would get that, too in the fully dynamics. Okay, yes, yep. There was one other thing I was going to mention. This is just kind of rationalizing kind of where the competition coming from. So kind of coming back to this idea. So does competition, is it going to increase or is it going to reduce innovation? You can kind of see how different versions of this model can have these kind of opposite effects, right? So in this case, if I add a foreign competitor firm as a neck and neck firm, you can see how it's going to lead to that increased competition effect, right? Whereas if the entrant is coming in ahead of the other firm, just kind of the case I was motivating here, it's going to lead to that Jupiterian effect of reducing kind of innovation. So this is kind of a model that can kind of address this tension, that can say, look, competition can potentially increase competition can potentially increase innovation, or it can reduce innovation, right? Because the model features both of those. Forces.
And the tension is reflected in the empirics.
I knew someone was going to get this question again. It's hard to do it. Yeah, so there's a lot. There's a lot of literature on kind of competition and innovation, right? First, some of it was just based on competition measured by Herfindahl indices, which is not ideal. There's some of them that have focused much more on that has focused much more on, for example, like, foreign entry competition or deregulation kind of things and they typically find they do find kind of this positive effect of competition on innovation. Now, do they tie it specifically to, oh, well, look, it's neck and neck type of competition versus the Jupiterian kind? That kind of hasn't been done. And kind of also as full disclosure too, kind of since we're talking about the empirical application. So I really like this kind of way of thinking about escape competition. I still struggle about how to kind of take that to the data, right? Because when I look at the data, I don't, what firms are neck and neck, the firms that are my follower firms, have they disappeared? So I don't see them in my sample. Which one of my firms are competing as part of the same J, or which ones are in separate Js? I just don't know. So there has been kind of some empirical work fitting kind of these models, and they always make me just a little bit uncomfortable because I don't see the clear connection between this modeling structure puts a very kind of specific structure on kind of, okay, you're neck and neck, and then with these very extreme versions of competition between the two, and I'm not sure kind of how that corresponds directly to the data, right? If I have the model like the Atkinson-Bernstein version, right, I have a whole bunch of firms kind of competing, whether it's kind of Cournot or monopolistic competition, I feel like has a better kind of parallel to the data. So I think that's one challenge for models of escape competition, is how to get a better empirical, a better connection to the data for those. With that being said, I'll kind of show you one that does make an empirical connection, and one that also kind of rolls through kind of the dynamics with escape competition, which is this very well-known inverted U paper. So this is a special case of, so this is just a special case of the model I showed you, but it kind of rolls through the dynamics to obtain kind of cross-sectional implications that I just wanted to highlight. So this is a case where there are going to be two firms in the sector. There's no exogenous entry, and you basically always have these two firms, and you don't have kind of the firms can kind of fall far behind, or kind of firm could go ahead. There's only kind of two possibilities for what's happening to the firms. They're either going to be neck and neck, right? Or one is going to be ahead of the other and is going to be the leader, and still the follower is still going to have that same probability of kind of catching up to the leader. So you only have just two possible outcomes, which in the paper they kind of call unlevel when you have the single leader, or level when you have a neck and neck. So this is in the dynamic version, so not this non-myopic version. So there's still an incentive for the follower to innovate. And so for this paper, kind of the way they were kind of thinking about competition is in these two ways. Okay. So what happens when you have these neck and neck firms? So the way that I was presenting it is only the tough competition case, right? Where basically you earn no profits if you're neck and neck. In the inverted U paper, they kind of add other sectors. So there, sectors exogenously are one or the other of perfect collusion. So in that case, you have two firms that are neck and neck, and they're just sharing the monopoly profits in that case. And so you can see how across these two types of competition, right, the incentives for innovation are going to be opposite, right? In this Bertrand case that which is the case I was mentioning before, there's a very strong incentive for innovation in the level when you're level one, right? That escape competition, and we want to escape from kind of making zero profits to making positive profits, right? So that's where you're going to have the strongest incentive for innovation, much weaker incentive for innovation once you're unlevel, okay? And it's going to be opposite when competition is very weak in the collusion case, right? So then you're doing very well when you're kind of neck and neck with your rival. You're sharing in the collusion problem. Sorry, you're doing well, but your incentives, of course, are going to be when you're unlevel, right? So this is when, if you're the follower, your greatest incentive for innovation is to catch up to the leader, be neck and neck, and enjoy these collusive profits between the two of you. So the strongest incentives for innovation are going to be wait, I keep saying it backwards. Yes, it's going to be in the unlevel. Yes, no, this is how I said it. I just had it backwards here. In the unlevel sector, right? So what you really want to do is then you're going kind of from zero profits to kind of neck and neck when there's collusion, which is going to mean sharing in those monopoly profits. Okay.
So they want to get two firms.
Yeah.
One sector.
No, I have a continuum. So I have a continuum of sectors J. But in every sector, I have two firms. In every sectors, I have two firms.
And in all of the sectors, you have the front.
Yep. Yes. Yeah. Yep. And always those two firms, no exogenous entry. So in any one sector, the only possibility is you're either what they call level, neck and neck, or one is ahead of the other, right? And in that case, like your innovation, right, is always going to be to you kind of move a step ahead, but there's no kind of explicit quality, right? So it's the only thing that matters in terms of innovation for your profits is whether you're level or unlevel, right? If you're the leader, you get the monopoly profits. And then if you're neck and neck, then it kind of depends. And this is exogenously determined. If you're the Bertrand competition, you get no profits, which is kind of the case that I had assumed before. But now I'm adding this also possibility of kind of collusion, right? And then and this is going to be very different. So across my different sectors, my incentive to innovate are going to be reversed depending on whether you're level or unlevel, depending on whether you're in the Bertrand or the collusion case. Yeah.
So in competition, if I'm the follower, I still have an incentive to innovate because I go from 0 to half in of the profit.
Yes. Yes.
But I have the same incentive even when I'm neck, right? Because then I go from half the monopoly profits to full.
Yes, but not as much. Yes.
Why not?
Because that difference from going to 0 to a half is bigger than going from half to 1. I mean, again, it depends on the firm, on the step, on the step size, right? But you can think of it as kind of proportionately, that's going to be a bigger increase. I have to say, I prefer the version that I talked about before. I just wanted, what I like about this paper is then you do the dynamics and then you kind of roll up what it's going to look like in steady state, which is kind of where I'm getting at. Oh, this is the sorry, I should have said this. I don't want to forget any clauses. So it's Guillaume, Blundell, Griffith, Van Reenen. Did I forget someone? The Bloom. Yes, I forgot Nick. Yeah. Guillaume, is it all of them? Guillaume, I know they've worked. I think it's Guillaume, Bloom. Richard worked on that paper for sure. And I think John was also.
Howard.
Oh, Howard, of course, Howard. How could I? And not John. Sorry, I put in John instead of Howard. Yeah. This came. Did I have the date here when I? No, I don't even have the date. So yeah, it's been a little while. This is one of the first papers that featured this escape competition.
May 2005.
Okay, May 2005. So what happens then? So the last point I wanted to make is kind of what happens when you what happens kind of when you roll up these effects across these different types of sectors, right? Is that these low innovation outcomes tend to be the absorbing state, right? So that in the sectors where competition is weak, right, where you have the collusion, the absorbing state is going to tend to be the level outcome, right? Because the firms then don't kind of have there's no kind of great incentive to kind of then innovate. Yes, you go from half to 1, but they're not. Those are not as strong. And I don't think you go to 1 automatically, right? Because when you're neck and neck, both firms are symmetric, right? So they both have an incentive to innovate. So you only get, it's not even half, right? It's like your innovation is successful and the other guy's isn't successful, kind of. So in a symmetric case, it would be a quarter, right? That you would get, and that reduces kind of your incentives to kind of those incentives to innovate. So that's why that kind of becomes the absorbing state. And then in the tough competition case, the absorbing case is going to be the unlevel outcome, where one firm is going to be ahead of the other. And essentially, this property is what's going to generate this kind of very famous kind of inverted U prediction for the impact of competition, right? That when competition, so what they think of as when competition is very high or very low, they're thinking about these types of sectors. And that competition is going to be kind of toughest in kind of in the middle because of these kind of aggregation properties. Okay. Now, again, if you come back and you ask me about, and so they have this empirical evidence kind of, this is for British firms. So as a level of competition, they kind of have the learner index, which is kind of the measure of markups, and they're kind of looking at innovation in terms of patents. And you can kind of see that there is kind of this pattern for the inverted U. It seems the evidence, is much more clear on kind of that there's this kind of increasing portion part of it. The downward kind of part of it, it kind of relies on kind of a much smaller set of sectors. And again, you can kind of ask about saying, well, what's going on, kind of what's going on here? Is it really kind of, and again, how do I think about, how do I take this, so this is data on a whole bunch of kind of British sector, right? Kind of sector by sector, looking at the average level of markups, right? It's not tying it directly to what I see in the model again. It's not kind of directly tying it to, well, I have, here are my kind of neck and neck firms, and they're kind of innovating at a much higher rate. So it's, again, there's a little bit of this disconnect. So you can kind of connect it at a more aggregate level, the way it's done here, but you don't kind of directly are testing kind of this mechanism of escape competition. Oh, this is where I had the slide. So I talked about this before, about kind of adding kind of entry into these models, and how you can kind of get entry, either having the Schumpeterian effect or having the arrow effect. And again, if you're interested in a paper that does kind of escape competition with kind of the foreign entry, this is this recent working paper that works out all of this. Let me just kind of close on this by kind of mentioning one other possibility for this positive effect of competition on innovation. So there's the ones that we talked about, where you could be in, if you fix the level of competition, which I think is the one that has the most close connection with the data, then you have this kind of unfortunate, then you only have kind of the Schumpeterian effect. So then it's like, well, how do I explain cases where kind of more competition is going to lead to more innovation? And maybe kind of the answer empirically is, well, maybe often kind of increased competition often comes with other things that also kind of increases the overall market size, right? So if it's really just kind of, maybe when there's more foreign competition, for example, even if it's just import competition, maybe what's happening is I'm also getting access to better intermediate inputs, right? And that's kind of allowing me to develop new products, and it's also potentially increasing my market size. So maybe kind of when we see this effect of competition potentially having a positive effect, it's not clear that we just want to say, oh no, I need another mechanism, I need escape competition, or I'll kind of talk about X inefficiencies. Maybe there are some forces in the cases where we see positive responses that are actually increasing the essentially the market shares for those that have successfully innovated. So I don't think that that's a question that's been completely settled. And then the other way also of generating this is some kind of, essentially you can think of some versions of X inefficiency. So something that basically says that the firms, the the owner of the firm was not maximizing is not maximizing profits. You're not kind of a first best, right? So the reason that it always goes in one direction, you always get the Schumpeterian effect when you don't change the level of competition, is you always have to explain to say, well, if there's increased competition and I see you innovating more, you always have to answer the question, well, why weren't you innovating more even when you didn't have the competition? If innovating more was such a good thing for you, right? And the answer, if you don't change the mode of competition, is, well, you should have been innovating more before, which is why you can't have that competition can't increase your rate of innovation. But once you introduce X inefficiencies, then you have a way of explaining that. And you can basically say, well, look, there's some kind of inefficiency that basically that before the firm wasn't innovating, and it should have been, but it's not due to some kind of agency problem. One of the ones that I find kind of very appealing is the one kind of based on an agency problem between a manager and the firm owner, right? Where essentially innovating is kind of expending more effort, it's costly for the manager, right? If the outcome of that innovation isn't magnified, then you have this agency problem that's going to lead to the manager to underinvest, basically, in that effort that's also going to underinvest in innovation. But if you kind of magnify the outcome in that case, so you increase competition. So now if you don't expand the effort, it can mean the difference between, in this model kind of making sure the firm stays out of bankruptcy or not, right? Then you can get the prediction that says, well, when it comes to that, then yes, I'm going to exert the effort, because then it's like, I want the firm to stay afloat, and as a manager, I want to kind of keep my job. So that's this idea of kind of foreign competition as a kind of kick in the pants, and it's going to induce the firms to innovate more, and that would be another possibility for that. And again, kind of just to close, I think this is an area where empirically, I think the empirics really kind of haven't caught up, right? So we have a lot of we have these different theories. We have a lot of good data both on the inputs that firms are using for R&D, both in terms of the output of R&D, so kind of in terms of very good kind of patent data that's been used a lot in this literature. We don't have, I think, very robust empirical answers for these exact channels that are linking competition to innovation. We see them kind of in the cross section. We see innovation being incredibly concentrated, especially for patents, in a very small subset of firms. I talked about kind of the evidence that we see, for example, for these kind of like new exporters or kind of young firms, that they grow faster and they tend to do more innovation. There's some more detailed kind of cross-sectional regularities that have been highlighted in terms of kind of expenditures per worker and how that kind of varies across firm size. But I haven't really seen anything convincing that really kind of connects these models in terms of is it really kind of the same type of, are there these different types of competition? Are there these very important variations between kind of neck and neck and being ahead where, you have this differential break in your profits? Or is it more of a case where, firms are just competing? There's a type of, equilibrium, be it kind of Cournot-Bertrand monopolistic competition, and kind of pure competition then really does have this negative effect. You have to add something that gives them this increased market size for then to have this potentially positive effect. And so, as you're thinking, if you're interested in this topic, I would definitely kind of encourage you to kind of keep thinking about how to connect these theoretical models to the empirical ones. We have this really good data on patents, on R&D across firms. And kind of, I think there's very important work to be done here in terms of highlighting which of these channels have better empirical bite. And so kind of with that issue about kind of future research, I'll kind of I'll stop there, and then for the afternoon session with Gianmarco, it'll be back to kind of static models, but thinking much more about endogenous markups.
Thank you.
Oh, I should, any questions?
I should turn the mic back on. Sorry.
Cases that could be the star patents are registered on a big company, but like a matching between a small company and a big company, and you cannot see it in the patent.
I mean, these firm-to-firm connections are very hard to observe empirically. Yeah, so for example, the models of spillovers where you learn from other firms are very hard to measure empirically. You can do it on the technology front. So there's a lot of, you can do work about, I cite I have patents, and my patents cite patents by other firms. And so you can kind of use that data to get at connections and about kind of potentially technology transfers. One thing that comes very strongly from that, actually, it's more connected to what Paul was talking about yesterday. If you look at the patent to patent connections, like who cites whose patents, they're incredibly strongly tied to supplier buyer relationships, right? So when a firm is a supplier to another firm, a firm is a customer to another firm, they overwhelmingly tend to kind of also cite each other's patents.
There are some industries which don't rely on patents to protect innovation, that trade secrets. And is there any hope of doing empirical work in those cases?
So what we don't, so the key, so another debate in this empirical literature is whether you want to measure innovation with inputs or with outputs, right? So with inputs, you can kind of still do that, and I guess then you're just stuck with inputs, right? Patents is at least a nice way of at least kind of comprehensively getting data on innovation outcomes, except for these sectors. The inputs to innovation, I always feel is a little bit suspect, just in the sense that it's a survey that you give to the firm, and they basically say, okay, these are, so maybe for big firms, big R&D labs, they can say, okay, these workers, I know how many workers work in this lab, and I know what the separate expenses are because I have a whole R&D kind of within my corporate structure. So maybe it works for the big firms. For the smaller firms, so I mean, especially thinking about the even smaller firms, I mean, how do you divide the time of, the people at the top are doing many different things, they're thinking about new business, they're running the firm. I mean, how do you accurately record what they spend on what's kind of innovation versus kind of keeping the firm running? So big issues too with measuring innovation as inputs too. And for those of you, by the way, for those of you who are interested too, I was talking about the connection. So sometimes you need to go to data that is confidential, although relatively easy to access. So for example, I've worked with data on kind of French firms where you can kind of have patent as well as these innovation surveys that the French firms do. The steps for getting access to that data are, they're not negligible, but they're not huge, and kind of they make these decisions. You can apply for access to the data. They review them every quarter. It's more of an issue. I mean, when you're in, it's much easier to access if you're within the EU than outside in an EU country. I've had students that have basically traveled back to an EU country so that they can use those kind of encryption boxes and use that data. So that's kind of one possibility. The other one that I just wanted to mention, and kind of the one that was used for this data. So this is a recent Harvard graduate who did this research on kind of companies that are connected as supplier-customer relationships and their patents, is based on CompuStat and the US patent database. And that's something that you already have available, right? So you can use CompuStat, and CompuStat is linked to the US patent database. So you can look at all the patents for public firms in the US and see how they're connected to all the other patents of publicly held firms. Yeah.
Can you also see production function techniques to estimate productivity and see time, like over time, how productivity has changed with competition?
With competition, or with innovation, or just with?
So productivity as a measure of innovation. So for example, I have a shop which is a shock to competition, and I use some of these techniques to map out productivity and see the impact of that competition shock on productivity.
I see. Yes, so you can do some, but then it's hard to figure out exactly kind of what the it's hard to figure out exactly kind of what the channel is. Is it kind of is it an innovation channel, or can it be kind of just a more direct can it be just a more direct channel? But you can definitely do that in some in some joint work with Gianmarco. We've used the French data and kind of looking at these kind of export shocks to look at not only kind of what happens to your pattern of product exports. I'll show you some of that this afternoon, kind of also showing that it really looks like there's some endogenous markups. But then the other thing we looked at is what is the impact on firm productivity? And you do see this kind of really big impact. And then the question is, well, what else is that related to? I mean, is it also kind of innovation that is going on, or can we think about that in just kind of a static model where if you have endogenous markups and you have this this market shock that there's going to be more competition, you're going to kind of lower your markup, and in terms of kind of revenue per worker, you're going to be generating more, which is going to show up as productivity. So I guess then the question is how should I interpret these productivity increases? Is it kind of something that is markup related, or is it something that is technology related? Yeah. And then for what it's worth, we didn't emphasize that in the paper. We also looked at these kind of exogenous import shocks, like I'm importing goods from countries and those countries are growing. That also had kind of strong effects on productivity. Where there again, it seems like it's much more plausible that it's a technology story of it makes me more productive.
Next.